This is another annex. It's outside the order, the linear order of reading that I've been adopting in reading A Biography of Ordinary Man. I want to consider an interview that was published in 1991 in his collection. But Laruelle talks about Biography of Ordinary Man, and as far as I can tell, the interview, this is a collection, so the pieces are from different times, but the interview I want to consider, called Heresy, an interview with Jean-Didier Wagner, came out in 1986 for the first time. And so A Biography of Ordinary Man was published in 1985. So this came out a year later. I'll put the link in the description. I chose this interview because it's been translated by Jeremy Smith. His website is really useful for a general approach to Laruelle. He's translated lots of stuff that is not yet translated into English, and even stuff that is difficultly accessible in French. So he translated this. It's only a rough translation, so a draft, if you will. So I'll be correcting it as I go along. Just as a reminder, people who've never translated may not realize that translating is a very long and slow process. And for something that might only take an hour to read, it's hours and hours of translation. So Jeremy Smith has been kind enough to do a rough draft, and I will make some corrections where necessary to the passages I read. I wouldn't take on the task of sort of proofreading the whole and making suggestions, because that would take a hell of a lot of time. So let's look at the beginning, because he goes over points that he covered in a different way in the foreword and in the introduction to A Biography of Ordinary Man. The first one is A Biography of Ordinary Man is Laruelle's 8th book, and it doesn't inaugurate. It is within what he calls Philosophy 2. The inauguration of Philosophy 2 was in the book 4 years earlier, The Minority Principle. So already we know that Laruelle's waves don't stop there, and he goes on to Philosophy 5, and Philosophy 5 has undergone a substantial evolution within its own terms. I think it's useful to remember that, because I think there's a problem with A Biography of Ordinary Man. He presents it as a virtue, as a feature, and I think that's true. But at the same time, it's a flaw, and that is what we called the leap into the absolute. And the problem there is, I think there is a methodological confusion or conflation with the idea of making the leap into the absolute leap, and making the leap absolutely. So that means, for example, that everything lines up for Laruelle in this book. It's a rigorous science of man, so rigor, science, and man all line up. So he will say later in the book that man is science. Man is man, the human, but he says man, is the absolute. So we've got the absolute, the rigor, science, man, all one thing. And I think that was an important step to make. But after we can already ask questions, and it's reassuring to know that we're not crazy, we're not blind, we're not forever inferior to the great leap that Laruelle made, because he himself later will undo this sort of soldering of these four instances into one block that is supposedly just the one. So it's good to know that Laruelle went on and underwent what he later calls waves rather than leaps. And the advantage of the wave image, well, I'm the one who uses the image of the leap, but the advantage of the wave image is that it's a non-absolute movement that can traverse the absolute, but without being itself absolutized. So Laruelle replies, between philosophy 1 and philosophy 2 there's a continuity and there's a break. So the continuity is very interesting because he says that it's how can we think the individual and the multiplicity which is attached to him or her. So expressed like that, I think that is still descriptive of the contemporary or one aspect of the contemporary problematic. That is to say, the relation between individuals or subjects and multiplicities. Is the individual or the subject totally dissolved into the multiplicities? Is the individual somehow identical or coincidental with the multiplicities? Is one primary over the other? All those questions are still with us, and I would like to remark that in the foreword to A Biography of Ordinary Man, we don't get that problematic till the second paragraph. What we get in the first paragraph is it's a systematic foundation, it's a rigorous science of man, it's a manual or it's a compendium, it's rigorous, it's didactic in fact. It's made of theorems. They're in the right order. You have to read them in the linear order, and you have to also realize that this linear order is of theorems is a linear order of experience and experiences, and these experiences are the life of every man. Okay, you read that, and you think he's crazy. I mean, that's a normal reaction. Unless you're some sort of starry-eyed Laruellian, you start off with that paragraph and you wonder, who is this crazy guy? Unless, I mean, this is sort of thesis-y. So I'm not an academic. I'm just an ordinary man reading Laruelle, and I read that and I think that's crazy. But at the same time, because I know it's Laruelle and I look a little further, and I know he's into individuals and multiplicities, I can just sort of live through the book, which is cheating according to him, according to this paragraph. I continue. And one of the things I've argued in my videos is that all these sort of rigorous, severe, austere themes and vocabulary are all to be understood in a transvalued way. But another thing that I argue is that Laruelle can't maintain that level of transvaluation all the time, and his disciples even less. So you're meant to make the leap into the absolute. So you transvalue all these terms. But it's in fact a common experience that you can't stay at the level of the absolute. You're going up and down all the time. That's Bernard Stiegler's point, that you're in noesis, one of his terms for the thinking in the absolute, only intermittently. So, and this is something that I think comes out in Badiou's Immanence of Truths and in Laruelle's Tetralogos. There is a process and there is an up and down, and you don't just stay in the absolute. So he's going to make mistakes. He's going to fall into error and take his idea of science in a authority way. So that's predictable, that's normal, but we start off with this sort of authority approach. Because I'm mentioning that because he's going to deny it later. But to give you an idea of Laruelle's evolution on this subject, I want to quote from a book, Mysticism, non-philosophical mysticism for the usage of contemporary people. So this was published in 2007, near the end of Laruelle's Philosophy 4, of his fourth wave. At the beginning, once again, the introduction is a real chapter. It's in A Biography of Ordinary Man. It's 31 or 32 pages. Here, the introduction is only 28 pages, but you can see from the pages that they're perhaps bigger pages. So Laruelle says, this second volume of the triptych inaugurated by the future Christ, A Lesson in Heresy, was first announced under the title of Mystical Theorems. So we've got mystical, which is in on the first page of the introduction of A Biography of Ordinary Man, when we have the 5 human theorems, and we have theorems. So originally this book was meant to be called Mystical Theorems. Would have been a conciser title, and from my point of view, a preferable one from certain points of view. We abandoned this exact title, so he's saying that would have been the exact title, whose equivalent that would have been just as exact so Mystical Theorems, that's an exact title. He abandoned that, and the equivalent that would have been just as exact was mystical fiction. But he abandoned that as well for a title that would be more immediately understandable. So this is the more immediately understandable title, non-philosophical mysticism for the usage of contemporary people. Yes, that's really intelligible. It's a matter of biography of humans as futures. So biography, yes, that's in the title to a biography of ordinary man. Human, that's the same thing as man in the title of biography of ordinary man. As futures with a capital F, that's new. In a biography of ordinary man, amongst all the things that Laruelle says that he wants nothing to do with, that's all the world authorities, old anthropological Greco-unitary thought is becoming. And here he talks about futures as it's just obvious that's what humans are. So he's had a big fluctuation in his waves. So while changing the title, this has not changed the sense so much, or since the natural element of theorems, I'll jump a bit, since the natural element of theorems is fiction. So this is a recontextualizing of his theorems in a biography of ordinary man, which were part of this absolute science. Here, maybe it's still absolute, maybe fiction is absolute, we don't know. But it's a substantial recontextualization. The natural element of theorems is fiction, about which one must straight away admit that it has very little to do with imagination. So it's fiction, but it's not imagination. I don't know why he would be against imagination in this book, given that he's in favor of invention. So I think imagination is being assigned to the imaginary of the world of authorities, whereas fiction is being assigned to the absolute, outside of and separate from this world, which is, from his point of view, hell. If this introduction requires a continuous reading and a linear comprehension, so here he's saying that not the book, as he claimed in the foreword to a biography of ordinary man. There he said that the book had to be read continuously and linearly. Here, Laruelle is saying for this book, the introduction requires a continuous reading and a linear comprehension. So anyhow, if this introduction requires a continuous reading and a linear comprehension, if it is a sort of exoteric memento for a theory, it is in order to equip the reader with an organon permitting possibly an aleatory reading, a reading that is free and dispersive, according to the hazard of the badly stitched together body of the text, made of advances, of regroupings, of research and investigations, of sketches of a verb or a word, capital V or W, made of lived axioms, but which constitute little by little une toile. You can say a canvas, or you could say maybe here, because of all the goings and crossings and so on, maybe he means a web, as in a spider's web. Both meanings are possible. So what he's saying here is, in appearance, the opposite of what he was saying in the foreword to a biography of Ordinary Man. You've got to be linear for the introduction to get the idea, and then you do a free and dispersive aleatory reading, and you crisscross, maybe go over the same things several times, but coming from different angles and going off in different directions, and you'll end up by having a non-systematic understanding of the whole. So that seems to me a more human, given that was one of his key words in a biography of Ordinary Man, that seems to be a more human form of understanding, and more multiplicitous form of understanding. So in this a biography of Ordinary Man, the beginning is philo-rigid, Laruelle, whereas the beginning of whatever it is, non-philosophical mysticism, is philo-fluid, or philo-fluid, or philo-dispersive. So one possible argument is that they're explicating the same method, but with slightly different perspectives or emphases. The seemingly philo-rigid first paragraph of this book is to be understood in a transvalued way, and this seemingly totally dispersive philo-fluid beginning of non-philosophical mysticism is itself meant to be understood in a transvalued way, because Laruelle is very rigorous, and he's not just sort of stitching things together in a haphazard way. So we get the same beginning as in the interview, this problem of individuals, the relation between the individual and multiplicities, in the second paragraph of a biography of Ordinary Man, where he says that we're following the rigorous order required by a transcendental science of individuals, that he abandons, so it's a thought of the one or of individuals, and one of the synonyms of the one is the absolute. It abandons the process of transition that the minority principle tried to follow pedagogically, taking you from philosophy to this rigorous thought of the individual, of Ordinary Man, and by contrast abandons this process and begins with the one or minorities. So the or there is asserting an equivalence. So he's identifying one, singular, and minorities, plural. So it is the relation between one and multiplicities, and said like that, it's a provocation to thought. We have to wonder, what can that mean? And after he'll go on not in the forward, but he'll go on to talk about minorities. We've got it in the title, so we were preconditioned to see it come up. So that's the continuity. We're in, and I would argue we are still in today, the problem of the problematic of the relation between individuals and multiplicities, or subjects and multiplicities, or individuals and minorities, or the one and multiplicities. The break, he claims, is one of means, and in the interview he says that in Philosophy 1, in his first 5 works, he was using Nietzschean means. And Nietzschean means for him were synthetic means. So in the first 5 works, I essentially use Nietzschean means, namely synthetic means, to try to think what the individual and his multiplicity were. So that's okay for establishing the contrast. It's not okay for establishing what Nietzsche's thought is, because saying that Nietzsche is the philosopher of synthesis is a little dubious. I mean, Nietzsche is a philosopher of multiplicities. You could argue that with the eternal return of the same, that he overcodes the multiplicities ultimately with a synthesis. That's what Deleuze and Guattari say in A Thousand Plateaus, in an amazing sort of offhanded sentence that nobody seems to have commented very much. But you could say that, and they don't seem to set much weight by it. They just throw it off in passing. But overall, it seems more reasonable to call Nietzsche a philosopher of multiplicities. So when he says Nietzsche means synthesis, Nietzsche means a synthetic means, that's once again in his dramaturgy. That's what Nietzsche is going to mean for him now in his second wave. So he hoped to first, in the minority principle, he hoped to reach radical individuality by the traditional means of philosophy, supposedly condensed, consigned, and synthesized in Nietzsche's thought. So he says he was basically in a quadrangle of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Deleuze, and Derrida. Because we've been talking about philosophy of science in relation to Laruelle, we can see that as similar to the claim that Newton made, that if I've seen further than those before me, it's because I've been standing on the shoulders of giants. So the shoulders of giants, the giants are Nietzsche, Heidegger, Deleuze, and Derrida. Laruelle does seem to have a lot of respect for them. Would he go so far as to call them giants, even in the sort of mock modesty or fake humility that Newton had? I don't know. But anyhow, he says it. That was his quadrangle. That was the base of his pyramid. So the minority principle was the break and the breakthrough, was imperfect and hesitant, and by contrast he's going to imply that a biography of ordinary man is perfect and non-hesitant. So I think it's, at least in its presentation of itself, non-hesitant, because it's the leap into the absolute, which is the beginning point. but imperfect, yes, it's automatically imperfect. And he recognizes it later with the quotation that I gave from non-philosophical mysticism, and just with the later waves. So it's a leap into the absolute, but it's not a perfect leap. Other leaps are possible, and more satisfying ones. So what emerged in this 1981 book, The Minority Principle, is that he realized that with philosophy one can never think the individual except in relation with a universal or submitted to a universal. Okay, and that's basically the conclusion that Lyotard came to in the postmodern condition, which came out, I think, in 1980, maybe 1981, but I think 1980. And Lyotard expressed it in terms of the collapse of grand narratives, and the grand narratives are based on universal principles of legitimation. So it's very similar to this collapse of thinking the individual by means of universals. Lyotard's conclusion, as for Lyotard, was with the collapse of the grand narratives. So we're seeing the Laruelle basically agrees with that and takes it for granted. But the conclusion may or may not be different. They're expressed in different ways. For Lyotard, you accompany metaphysics in its collapse. This is something that Laruelle does in A Biography of Ordinary Man. And you emerge yourself into the micrologies. They're the tiny little things that describe the experiences in terms of multiplicities, a multiplicity of experiences in terms of multiplicities. Laruelle, in a sense, could be said to be making a similar move, because he's identifying individuals with multiplicities. But micrological thinking is not the sort of term that would describe the sort of grandiose posture that Laruelle's dramaturgy is making him adopt here. He says, I try to think the individual directly from himself or herself, and I ask myself under what conditions one can think the individual in this way. So I think that's very interesting in the sense that one is getting away from the universals. So this may be a microology type statement, thinking the individual from himself. The individual is minorities. So there may be implicitly a notion that we're not having the logos of the anthropological tradition. One could call that a micro-logical means of thought. I don't think Laruelle would like this notion of micro and macro, but there's an affinity there. The second thing that I want to take note of in that sentence is I ask myself to what conditions one can think the individual in this way, or I would say under what conditions. We talked about this in one of the linear videos, that there is a similarity in Laruelle's approach with Badiou's approach, in that both consider that man, or the subject, is, or thinking, is outside the question. So one can say, if it's outside the question, if the question as we ordinarily think of it is in this closed, congealed world of the authorities, what is outside? And both come to this idea that a better term than questions is conditions. So they have a different idea of conditions, but this is a point of convergence, and it's important to note that there are these points of convergence, but that don't exactly coincide, because we don't want to get trapped and congealed and enclosed into any one system. We don't want to get enclosed in Badiou's system and become a Badiousian, and we don't want to, I'm supposing, get trapped and enclosed in Laruel's system and become a Laruelian. And if we did, it would be a Laruel-Tuian, because Laruel has gone on to other things and fluidified and pluralized all that. So that's a methodological claim that I don't think Laruel lives up to for the moment in this book directly, but that is the idea that to think multiplicity and the relation between individuals and multiplicities, you need more than one research program. And that may be from the point of view of after the event, because Laruel is launching himself into this research program, and he has to close off the other options to a large extent and think this through, and then he will maybe come out the other side, maybe by looking at other programs around him. That's a different question for the evolution of his research program. So the important thing to see is there's this idea of conditions rather than questions that we may not have noticed straight away in the book A Biography of Ordinary Man, but it is there right from the beginning, because the beginning is, this book attempts a systematic foundation for a discipline, blah blah, a rigorous science of man. So he's putting thought, his thought, but thought itself, beyond philosophy or outside of philosophy, under the condition of science. As I said, he was also putting it under the condition of man, and maybe we'll see already in this interview that we could drive a wedge between the two conditions. Under the condition of science is one thing, under the condition of man is another. You can, at least in terms of thinking about the meanings, you can say that they coincide. That seems to be his approach in this book. I think he will relativize science, at least to a certain extent, in a later book, and then man may be the predominant concept, and science one of the important but less predominant concepts. To give you an idea of what I mean, I would like to refer back to non-philosophical mysticism, where he seems to drive a wedge between the two. He says, what does he say? He's talking about a different economy, a conceptual economy for thinking about philosophy. So he says, page 32, so it's the end of the introduction, and in the passage I read from the beginning of the introduction, he refers us to the end to get an idea of some of the implications of what he's saying. So here he says, philosophy and science, this epistemological binary, is in fact an abstraction as little relevant as the binary of philosophy and religion, without talking about the idealist, without mentioning the idealist attempt to isolate an activity that would be purely philosophical or transcendental. So he seems to be saying that this attempt to isolate out the notion or the concept or the essence of philosophy in a biography of ordinary man, face to face with the essence of science, is idealist. And he goes on to say that what he's trying to do is create a geography, I suppose, of a non-philosophical massif, like the Massif Central, which has 3 peaks: philo-fiction, mystic fiction, and science fiction, or epistemo-fiction. And the first, philo-fiction, is surrounded symmetrically, or flanked, if you will, by the 2 others, whose materials, whose initial materials, touch the real of philosophy. So what he's saying there is that there's no priority within non-philosophy, as he's come to conceive it, of science. He says just a little before, on page 31, with we have le mystique and la mystique. So it's going to be a little difficult to make that distinction. So le mystique is the good mysticism, and la mystique is traditional mysticism. So with traditional mysticism, what we call non-philosophy seems to entertain relations of affinity and arrive at a terrain that it would have only provisionally abandoned for the terrain of science or of ethics. So once we get to the perspective on mysticism, we think there's a special affinity with non-philosophy, and we think we get to a sort of a higher ground, or a better ground or terrain that had been abandoned provisionally. So once again, the idea that what we thought was a non-transitional biography of ordinary man was a transitional move, a provisional move, where we abandoned the terrain of mysticism and non-philosophy for the terrain of science and non-philosophy. He goes on to say, it would be more correct to say that philosophy, after having been treated schematically by its external base, with the occasional help of science, is now treated from above by its peak, so its vertex, the that is hyper or super philosophical, unified this time with a mysticism that is itself occasional. So occasional there doesn't mean from time to time, it means it's the occasion for. It's in our old talk, it's conjunctural. So he's saying, somewhat like Althusser said when he discussed his scientism in terms of bending the stick in one direction because it was too bent in the other direction and you had to get to something straight, so you had to go overboard in the other direction. So Laruelle is saying that the relation between this new thought that he's going to later call non-philosophy and science is conjunctural. It's occasional. Science is the occasion for the new thought, is not the absolutely integral, essential definition of the new thought. And because it's occasional, other occasions can flank it on other sides.